like to discuss the book Rebecca by Daphne Du Maurier. It's a classic of romance and gothic and slightly a horror novel. Okay? And I think that a lot of people, I think most readers don't really understand this book. And in my insights, I'm building onto an article that I read, I believe it was in The Atlantic, which made some of the points that I'm going to make and include me into the whole idea that there is a subtext in this novel that is generally missed. Okay, first of all, it's called Rebecca. It's named after a woman who has been dead for 18 months when our story starts. Okay, our narrator appears to be a very sweet, submissive, passive, modest type of young lady. Okay, and she falls in love with the wealthy widower of Rebecca, Maxim de Winter, and lives at his estate, which is called Manderley. Now, one of the most interesting things about this is the narrator is the young lady who falls in love with Maxim de Winter, and she never is given a name. The fact that she is never named may be significant. Okay? It is named after a dead woman. Okay? And the name Maxim de Winter, what does that suggest? I mean, it's a very romantic name. It sounds kind of masculine, but it also has a kind of law of coldness within it. Okay? Manderley, could that be world of man? Or could it be a stand-in for the whole idea of patriarchy? Now, Rebecca dominates this book, even though she has been dead for such a long time. Okay, and the narrator, though, fears that her husband is still in love with this dynamic woman who's described as very active, very dynamic, and she herself feels kind of like a wallflower, very submissive, very shy, very reticent, okay? And so she thinks, well, I can't compete with this woman who is dead. All right, and of course, she also has a relationship that is very uneasy with housekeeper Mrs. Danvers. And there's always been a perception of Mrs. Danvers as the villain of this story, or at least the secondary villain. She was the maid to Rebecca and still appears to be fascinated by Rebecca, whom she kind of also half raised as a kind of nanny. Now, oddly enough, though, this is a villain who has no power. Mrs. Danvers is a servant, and our heroine can't just fire her at any time. When Mrs. Danvers makes her uncomfortable, she can just say, you got your walking papers, leave. And in fact, Maxim de Winter mentions that, that if you don't get along with Mrs. Danvers, we can always just sack her. But even when she's uncomfortable around Mrs. Danvers, she never even thinks about firing her. And she desperately wants to please. She wants to get the approval of Mrs. Danvers, of a servant. Okay, at the same time, we learn that the dead Rebecca, we eventually learn, was not a traditionally moral woman. She had boyfriends, and she and Maxim de Winter, to a large extent, lived apart. He didn't want the scandal of a divorce, but he knew that she was fooling around on him. Okay, he also says at a certain point, she wasn't even natural, she wasn't even normal. She told me things I could never repeat to another living soul. Now, what does this suggest? She's so close to Mrs. Danvers, whom she calls Danny. Okay, and she's not normal. In my opinion, Rebecca, it was written in the 1930s, not the Victorian era, is to some degree the female version of the picture of Dorian Gray. Okay, I also think it's very telling that in the novel, Our heroine is very relieved when she finds out that Maxim de Winter hated Rebecca and didn't love her. But she's completely nonplussed when he tells her that he murdered her because she told him that she was pregnant by another man, and he could not allow Manderley to be inherited by another man's son. Okay, or another man's child, but we kind of assume it would be a son. And the odd thing is the heroine isn't at all bothered by the murder, nor is she at all bothered by the motive for the murder, the pregnancy. Okay, so that kind of says something that maybe her moral compass is broken. And that Rebecca has to some degree outwitted the patriarchy, or, kind of, in some sense, might in fact be seen as the heroine and the narrator as the anti-heroine. But anyway, I just want people to look, when they read this book, not accept everything as superficial, at superficial level. Because, as a teacher wisely said, don't trust the narrator. The narrator is not the author. I hope you like what you heard and will subscribe to my channel.